Well, welcome to the Deadly Analysis podcast. My name is Noah Adam. I am here today with three very intelligent people that are going to talk about one of my favorite horror films of all time. And I'm starting the segment that way because if they have anything negative to say, I'm just going to shit all over them because I really like this movie. So that's kind of a warning. It's like an implicit warning that I'm throwing out right at the beginning of this, that they better like the film. So anyway, I'm here with Shayra, Jonah, and Antonio. And Antonio actually just watched the film today for the first time, so I'm very anxious to get his input as well. So if you haven't seen the podcast on It Follows that I dropped, go check it out. It's on Facebook and YouTube at Deadly Analysis. And today I'm just hoping to get my friends' opinions on the film and see what they take away from the movie and how it's a little different from my interpretation, my conceptual analysis. So I'm just going to throw out a really simple question. What did you guys think of the movie?
I thought it was fantastic. As a person who's watched a lot of the old school horror films, I feel like it was really giving a shout out and paying homage to that kind of horror, but stepping it up and making it extra scary even for today. So I thought it was a all around good horror.
So you watched it with your kid. Did they just
Yes.
never, like, that sex may be the most horrifying thing on the planet to them after seeing this film now?
It is really interesting because, she's 13 and that's right around the time when you start to dabble in those things. So there was a lot of jokes being made between her and her friends, like, this is why you don't have sex. And, I thought it was really funny because it reminded me of those urban legends that you hear about all the time that try to make you scared about parking alone with a boy or trying to drink at a party. It's really funny. It's going along with those a little bit, but I think that there was something deeper to this particular film. Jokes aside with teenagers, they did get into more in-depth conversations, especially when you have people around their age group talking about philosophy so in depth in the movie. They started asking questions. We started Googling stuff. It made them actually try to understand the film on a higher level. So even though there was those jokey moments, there was also those deeper moments, and I think that was fantastic. But yeah, there was a consensus that they probably shouldn't have sex for a while because you never know.
Yeah, I feel like the film took the very common trope that sex is evil and sex is bad and sort of smothered you with it, right? It took that sort of banality that's in a lot of 80s and 90s horror films, the stuff that you see made fun of in Scream, for example, going back to kind of our last podcast, and it basically like turned it into the monster. It literally said, okay, let's take this trope and not necessarily add it as like just another film that has that trope, but let's just throw it in the audience's face and make it the fucking monster. And then in light of, I think, of a larger purpose, a larger narrative of the story, I don't think that this movie really was all about sex. I mean, it clearly had sexual themes and there were lots of sexual elements, but I think that was one part of a larger context that we'll get into. What about you, Antonio? What did you think? This was your first time watching it today, right?
It was. I think that I really enjoyed the movie. It consciously, it's an extremely aware movie. It consciously throws back to a bunch of kind of retro tropes and references, while also consciously trying to innovate on them and avoid a lot of the mistakes that cheaper horror movies fall into. Sex, for example, I think is one of those throwbacks. I think that it's a reference to the way other horror movies play on sex. I think if in a deeper analysis of the movie is actually very, very little about sex in reality. I think the main theme of the movie has a much broader existential kind of flavor. And sex is just kind of the framing device that throws back to other horror movies. I particularly liked that they tried to generate menace through tone, through very carefully established camera shots, through the colors that various characters wore in various scenes. And not through a whole lot of violence, gore, jump scares, et cetera, et cetera. Or even a scary looking monster. The scariness of it was kind of its implacability, its mutability, and the notion that something that is in a human body and behaves in a way that we kind of expect humans to behave is nonetheless totally alien. That's like, it's an uncanny valley kind of scare is what they're trying to generate. So yeah, really liked the movie. Thought that honestly, the cinematography reminded me a lot of another. It's not exactly a horror movie; it's a zombie movie. Fido. If you've never seen that, absolutely recommend it. Really, really carefully constructed color scheme in particular is one of the things I noticed about the movie. Another thing I noticed about the movie was that in kind of throwing back to earlier films as well as kind of anticipating its own future, maybe the movie's timeless. I don't know if you noticed, but there's all kinds of anachronistic, contradictory elements in the decor, in the cars the characters drive, et cetera, et cetera,
I
that
don't.
really tries to place the movie out of time as we know it. And I think this again sort of reflects toward the more existential themes of the movie.
So for the timelessness piece, yeah, I actually really like that. I felt it added to kind of the atmospheric dreamlight state that the film sort of put you in through the ambiance of the music, which we'll get into, which was unbelievably experimentary and kind of on the forefront. I've yet to go to a horror movie where I felt like the music was such a like a hand-in-hand partner with the rest of the film. I felt like I mean, without that score, that film would not be anywhere near as good as it was. But in terms of the timelessness, yeah, I think that if you want to get somewhat poetic, it kind of, it ties sexuality to a kind of an otherworldliness, kind of a mystic sort of context to it. I think that when you're bound to like 70s, I think Jonah kind of hit this, but when you're bound to like 70s sort of settings, that I think that takes away from the film. I think that this it allowed me at least to focus. So it's interesting that for Jonah, it was harder for him to focus for that. I felt like for me, the more separated it got from a timeline that I could identify with, I felt less inclined to look for things to identify what timeline it was in. I know it sounds really weird, but I was like, oh, this feels like a dream. This feels like a dream. I get it. And I just kind of let that happen. I do want to ask Jonah, so just to be clear, the fact that the film had a timeless element to you, like, was distracting.
It didn't distract so much that I couldn't enjoy it, but
Sure.
what I felt was that if it had picked and adhered to a specific timeline, um, I wouldn't have enjoyed the film less. You know what I mean? Like it didn't make it the fact that it was ambiguous. It was cool and it was experimental, but I don't think it was necessary for the film to function. I
Can
understand why they
I
put it in.
weigh in on the timelessness thing?
Yeah.
So I think it added to the tone, because the tone of the movie is it's you're confused. There's something weird happening. You can't really put your finger on it. Something strange about the whole thing, and the timelessness I think added to the what the fuck moment to it. You know, you're sitting there like, where are we? What's happening? What in the hell is going on here? That confusion is added with that timelessness, I think. So I I enjoyed it. I did notice it, and I guess in some ways I was distracted because at one point, I'm like, wait, that car's from the 70s. Oh, wait, but that car's kind of new. And we were discussing, what is this shell thing? So we did discuss that, and it did distract in some ways, but it added to that what the fuck is going on moment. And so for me, it just added to the tone of the movie. Even though it might have been slightly distracting, I kind of enjoyed that because you're trying to solve a mystery, and that's generally, you're not going to solve this mystery, but that's generally what you enjoy, is you're trying to pick things apart and figure out what to do. So
I guess an interesting question I want to ask is: are the characters? This is kind of stupid, but are the characters self-aware of that timelessness? Like, do they feel weird and unsettled by the fact that like they don't? Because that could also be seen as a metaphor for a sense of belonging. And when you're a teenager, you don't know where you belong and you don't relate to anything. And you could say that if we're going to talk later about adults and growing into adulthood, like you're always cooler than your parents. So there's this element of this is a world that I don't belong in. I'm living in an adult world right now, and I'm still a child.
Mm.
And I don't know. There's a lot that can be said.
I think you're onto something. I really think you're onto something. That to me is one of the larger parts of the film. I never really thought of that, actually. I never thought of the fact that the timelessness is part of well, and what Shara said, that timelessness adds to the question mark of the film, because when you're watching this movie, there is kind of a question mark lingering. There's a lot of them. You just kind of feel like, what's going on, right? I said in the beginning of my podcast that I'm hard pressed to think of another movie that's better to go into than this one, not knowing anything about it. If you go into this film not knowing anything about it, I think it adds infinitely to the enjoyment, precisely because of the issues of timelessness and all of this kind of contradictory stuff. They have CRT televisions. They only show black and white stuff. Like if you notice, all the stuff that they watch on the TV is only black and white.
And movies from like the 50s. But
Yeah.
see, that's the thing. That, I mean, you could say a sophisticated person only watches old movies or only listens to old music, or you can still drive old cars, you know, so, and you can have old houses in rundown neighborhoods. The phone was really the only solidly anachronistic element for me. That was the only thing that, because everything else exists in this world. The fact that the cell phone was the, you know what I'm saying? That all the other things that they have, you can still we have in our own world. So,
Sure.
That to me was actually one of the most interesting things, and it's actually really cool to see the spectrum of interpretations on the timelessness element here, because I actually drew something completely different away from that, and that is that the timelessness to me wasn't so much to make things dreamlike or disorienting or frame the film in some way, so much as it seemed to me to essentialize the movie. In other words, to say that to express that the message of the film is beyond any particular frame of reference. It's talking to something that is core to our humanity. And there's a bunch of different examples of how they sort of set this up, if in my opinion. For example, the phone is, I think, a representation in some ways of the future, because it doesn't exist at the time that the film was released. There's nothing like that out there currently in the world. And so that this is a representation of something that could be in the near future, right? But at the same time, if you wind the clock back, you can see all kinds of interesting references. You know, you see the stuff from the 50s, you see cars from the 70s, you see various things from the 80s, sort of framed in the backgrounds. When they go out to the beach house, and there's that old mansion, and these are things that are probably more like turn of the century, maybe over 100 years old. The elements of the film are set up to span an extremely wide and mutually exclusive period of time. And because of this, I think that it serves to try to push the viewer into looking only at the actual narrative elements, as opposed to trying to frame this in a broader world. This is almost a fairy tale, as it were. You know, this is something that could take place in any kind of sort of magical realist sort of environment. And in that sense, it transcends time. It's not merely timeless. The timelessness is actually an important element to point to the fact that these are talking about bigger themes than any one era experiences, something that's core to the human experience.
There's a kind of a couple things going on here. I feel like we're dancing around really deep issues. One of them being that this movie sort of inexorably links sexuality to death. One of the big things in this film that I felt was just really, to me, was one of the larger points, was the idea that your mortality follows you everywhere you go, that you're going to die. And sex is inexorably linked to mortality. The fact that your parents had intercourse, right, is the reason that you exist. It's why you're here, and it's why you're going to die. It's why eventually you're not going to be any longer, because of an action of your parents. When the monster takes the form, span the spectrum, a young person, a middle-aged person, and an old person at the end of their life slowly following you. I think that's important. So the monster is almost like, in some ways, a placeholder for our sexual psychology. And I think that that's part of, I think, a larger conversation about the idea of dying, about having it follow you. And I think the cipher for this in the film is the passages that Yara reads from her little compact. They're from Dostoevsky's The Idiot. And they're not about STDs. Don't know if you noticed that. They're not about STDs. One of the things I just got really, in the theater, I remember leaving. I'm just going to tell you a story. I saw it twice in the theater, and the second time I was in the theater, like, people were talking about, it's about STDs, and I literally wanted to kill somebody. I was like, this fucking movie is not about STDs. That's not the point of this film at all. And then I had someone else in the theater be like, oh, this film wasn't that scary. And then I almost climbed a clock tower and killed like 20 people. So, anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, right? The monster, I think, to me, the way I interpret this is the monster is an amalgamation of issues that I think on a surface level could be described as differing aspects of our sexual psychology, especially to an adolescent. But I think that the horror of it is in glimpsing a kind of transition, a transition from adolescence to adulthood, to a place where you realize that you're in the meat grinder just like everybody else, and that you're going to die, that your bubble is broken, right? That you're no longer in the world of innocence. Think of Jay when she's in her pool. The movie starts with her just kind of floating around in her pool. That's her safe zone. That's her place of innocence. And at the end of the movie, where does she go to fight the monster? She goes back to the place that's knowable to her, that makes her feel comfortable, which is a pool.
Also, water is the source of life.
But also, I don't know if you guys noticed, but her pool that she was swimming in originally at one point is like broken, and there's no water in it anymore. And then she goes into that bigger pool. So I think
Not
that
only
does
that,
reflect on adolescence a lot.
Sure. Not only that, but that same scene, Shayra, if you actually, so I added it to my podcast. The break in the pool, this may just be me reading way too much into this. I've been like editing this for like 6 hours, but like the actual break in the pool is almost like, the imagery is almost like a vagina. Like the break in it, if you just look at it, I feel like I'm going to come off like a psychopath by saying this, but if go back,
absolutely.
Okay, all right, thank you, Antonio.
Yeah, to me, the pool absolutely represents the womb. It is 100% a representation of the uterus in both scenes where it appears prominently. That is absolutely what that is intended to symbolize, and the break in it is absolutely intended to symbolize like a violent birth.
Well, think about the ending sequence with when they shoot they shoot the monster in the water. What happens? The pool fills with blood. I mean, I've never like seen more of like period imagery in a film. If you go see that sequence and go look at it, right? It's the finality of the film. It's the climax of the film, no pun intended. It's the climax of the film, and her safe zone is shattered, right? I mean, I guess you could make that argument in the middle of the film where the pool is broken after she goes and sees those guys on that boat, right? That's right after that sequence. And I what did you guys think? Did she actually go and like sleep with those guys on the boat? I felt like that was unclear.
I think she did, and I think they died. I don't think they lasted that long. I think this is one of the things where the guy that she slept with was really overthinking things. He wanted to get someone strong that he thought could battle this, so as to protect himself in a way, she was like, okay, last minute decision, let's try to do this. But I did get the feeling, because she came back she was all wet, like she'd gone in the water.
Yeah.
If she did decide to go back, she went in the water and was considering it at the very least.
She was crying though. So she was either crying because of the guilt of what she did, or because she didn't have the courage to do it. And I'll add, while I have the conch shell, that the blood in the pool could also be sign as the hymen breaking. It's like the end of virginity.
Sure.
Or miscarriage.
If the water is going to be a vagina, then that would be...
Or even just straight up birth.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so let's follow with that, Antonio. So what is I kind of was beginning to ask this a little while ago. So what is this film about, really, to you? Like, how do you interpret? Give me a 2-3 minute. This is what I interpret the film to be about.
Yeah, the film to me is about it's an extremely primal film. Like I said, I think the film takes pains to frame itself in a way that is very essentialist and tries to speak to core elements of human experience rather than trying to tell a particularly nuanced plot. And so the core of the film to me is about mortality. And it's about the human experience of mortality, specifically through reproduction, right? The notion of the monster symbolizes death or mortality. It's something that is always following you. It is slowly creeping up on you. You never know when it's going to eventually come up behind you and grab you. And once it gets you, it's extremely difficult to escape, and you're probably going to just be over. And the only way that you can avoid it is by passing it on to someone else. And this I think is symbolic of reproduction in some way. You know, you attempt to escape your own mortality by having children effectively. But the problem is that when you have children, it passes the curse to them too. They are
Mm.
now being stalked by the same thing that haunts you. You can still see it, and eventually it's going to come back and get you. No matter how many other generations it goes through, it will eventually work its way back up the chain to you, right? So so to me, the movie is the sexual framings and all these are pretty much just window dressing at core, you know, and especially I think in the final scene of the movie, or the second to last scene of the movie, where they're reading the last line from Dostoevsky, right? Um, that whole line is pretty much a restatement of the film's ethic. It's about mortality. It is about the inevitability of your destruction, of the crumbling of the things that you know and you trust, and so on. And so ultimately, honestly, I view the film not so much as a horror movie as an existential work, you know, an existential piece that happens to be framed as a horror movie. And there's a lot of ways in which I think the film emphasizes this through some of the way that it does its camera work. A lot of the camera work is very silent and follows the characters around in kind of mutely, without giving a whole lot of judgment. There's not like music playing in a lot of these scenes. And there isn't a whole lot of background or ambient noise. You can't hear the characters dialoguing with each other. The camera is just panning. It's just showing you things, right? And I think that this really emphasizes the existential quality of the film. That this is basically what life is about. You know, that life is you know, you're as you grow into adulthood, you come to realize through, you know, as you get your sexual life underway, I guess, that you can strive for a sort of temporary immortality by passing your genes along, as it were. But in the end, it is going to get you, you know, and there's nothing you
Interesting.
can do about it.
Yeah. Shayra, did you get the same vibe? I took 80%, I'll say, of the way Antonio viewed this film is exactly how I took it. The only difference between him and I think, would be the focus um, on the next generation and on birthing, whereas I think it was more about transition from an early time to a later time. And I'll kind of say why in a minute. I think Antonio's, as he's talking, I'm getting a little frustrated because his conceptual analysis explains more of the damn film than mine. But that's okay, because I have some things that I think may be hard for him to explain. So I'll get into those in a minute. But what did you take anything like that away? Like, was mortality, was death the thing that sort of stood out from you as for you as kind of the main theme of the film?
I love what Antonio said. I think it's fantastic. That's not what I took away from it, but I feel like he probably is more correct, if that is even a way of saying it, because it's an interpretation of a work. For me, I looked at it as more of a coming of age film. Um, you know, when we watch movies like Stand By Me and Now and Then, and obviously this is aging me, but when we watch movies like that, we are usually reflecting on two different lives. We have the when we were about 12 or 13, and then we have, all of a sudden you'll fast forward to when people are already got their careers going, they already own their homes. There's this huge gap where it just seems like it doesn't matter. Who cares? This part doesn't matter. And I feel like that's what adulthood is. There's becoming an adult, and then there's realizing that you used to be a kid. And those are the only moments that really matter in all of these coming of age films. And I felt that kind of vibe from this film, in that we're reflecting on the fact that there is a change that we go through, and then it doesn't really matter after that. Nothing really matters after that. You've become an adult. Yay, it sucks. Welcome to the club. You're going to die soon. And I know it's a really messed up way of looking at what adulthood is, but that's how I've always reflected on becoming an adult. You know,
Well, yeah, there's I'm sorry, Antonio, real quick. There's a scene in the movie that perfectly reflects what you're saying when they're in the theater and they play that game. You know, who would you rather be? And who does Hugh say he'd rather be? He'd rather be that child, right? He has a whole life ahead of him, right? And I think she makes the comment, well, like, you're only 21 years old, you know? And I think that's precisely happening to him because he's in that state of shifting, right? Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. Go ahead, Antonio. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, one of the really interesting things for the movie, in the movie, I thought, was there are no adults. Like, you see adults, but they don't have any lines of dialogue. You barely see
They're
their faces.
blurred. They're blurred
Yeah.
when you see them most of
Yeah.
them.
They have absolutely no presence in the film. There's nobody who's like over 21 basically in the film in any significant way, except for the beast, which occasionally takes the form of an adult or an old person. And there's obviously a bunch of different ways you can read that. The way that I actually read it was the notion of denying gradations in development beyond adolescence. In other words, to me, the takeaway was we're all still kids inside. This thing is chasing us, and we're never we don't actually manage to. We don't come of age. We don't escape our adolescence. We don't graduate to adulthood. That's this mute pillar. It's this cipher. It's something that doesn't really exist. The only things that actually exist are the 17-year-old inside the 41-year-old, or what have you.
That's interesting. I took it as something like the fact that this transitionary period can feel so isolationary, that it can feel alone, that you feel like even with the greatest family, even with family who love you and who are there for you, it's something you do on your own. It's something that you can't really have other people do for you, adults do for you. It is your coming of age story, and therefore it feels to many people, I think to most people who grow up and go through adolescence, extremely isolationary. So that's kind of how I interpreted the fact that you don't have a large adult, you don't have a large adult presence at all in the film.
There's a reason why the monster will start following you once you have sex, and it's because I see that sex is the way it's trying to say, and this is a very cynical and unpleasant interpretation that probably is only affects me, but that having sex is your way of becoming an adult. There's all these idioms about, oh, you're a man now, I'm going to make a man out of you, and that all relates to sex. So it's if you don't have sex, you're not a real adult, and you're still a child. Even if you're, the whole 40-year-old virgin, like the whole thing is you're just a kid. You don't understand life. So once you stick it in them, whichever hole that you prefer, that becomes your way of becoming an adult, and you won't be one until you have that experience.
Do you feel that was normative in the film, or was that something that it was trying to build off of and describe as part of the American upbringing? Do you think that was normative, or do you think it was like descriptive?
Descriptive, because it's not. I've seen that theme in many, many, many texts, not just film.
In other words, I guess what I'm asking is like the film's not trying to say, hey, in order to be an adult and to make this transition, like one of the only ways is to have sex. Do you think that it's implying that, or is it just utilizing that as something that's pretty commonplace?
A little bit of both. Can I say that?
Yeah.
Because the last shot in the movie is a really extended shot of them holding hands. So why is that so important? It's because it's the relationship aspect, because it's moved on from sex to intimacy. So
okay.
Now they're having a relationship rather than just having sex. So and I had to watch it with subtitles because I had to turn the sound down a little more than I normally would. And so because of the subtitles, it says, kids chattering in the background. So on top of them holding hands, it indicates that they're still kids. Because it's like there's two things going on. The audio, what's being communicated audibly and visually, and they're two different messages. If you blindfolded your eye, if you covered your eyes and so all you could do was hear, you would hear kids, and if you covered your ears, all you would see them is holding hands. So that's telling two different. They're unrelated messages.
That even might go into what Antonio was saying earlier, where we're all still children, no matter what inside of us. That goes along with that too, and it kind of creeps me out.
Well, to add on to that, even to add on to that, there's a lot of imagery in this film that goes back to, even when they're in their adolescence, they're going throughout the course of this film trying to figure out what's going on with the monster. I mean, did you ever like the little things? So like when they're drinking soda out of Coke cans, there's straws in them. Like that's important to me. I mean, the only time I drunk like Coke with a straw was when I was a kid. The only time I had a juice box, like at the end of the movie when Yara's drinking the juice box, you do that as a kid. When Jay is in her room, like locked herself in her room, she has like this perfectly cut sandwich, like your mom would make, and it slowly molds over the course of the film. It's almost like the film's trying to. What I took from that is like the film's trying to tell you like there's this degradation process going on. You're maturing. You're growing out of this. This is now going to become foreign to you. It's old. There's now this new thing that is facing you. There was some other stuff. Shit, I forget. I'll have to look at my notes, but there was some other stuff. There's a lot of things. Oh, the ice cream. When they're trying to make Jay feel better, you know, they give her ice cream. There's all these little things that you do with kids. And I think that kind of adds to like, we're all still kind of kids. I thought that just was out of place. Like it was so out of place in the film. It really stuck out to me when they were all sitting down in that circle with Hugh. And like, they all have like, it looks like this perfect little play date. Like they all have these little Coke cans with like straws in them. And I was thinking like, this is like kid stuff.
I feel like a major theme in the movie is sort of the reestablishment of a childlike intimacy, right? I feel like this is kind of the loop that the movie takes you through because as everybody's mentioned, you know, there's all these allusions to childhood in various ways. There's sort of an implication that maybe we're all kids inside. And from the very beginning of the movie, there's a yearning expressed for the simplicity and the liberty of childhood, the ability to not have to worry about other things, right? As Hugh says in about the kid in the movie theater, you know, he wishes he were, even though he's just a young adult, he wishes he were a kid. And the reason why he wishes he were is because, you know, kids don't have as many responsibilities. They're more carefree. They don't know what's out there, right? And you know, in the hand holding scene at the end, I feel like is kind of a symbolic notion, as well as, of course, the friends working together, the notion of friends working together to sort of get past this crisis, right? Is that, you know, we face our mortality, and that's an incredibly, as you said, Noah, an isolating experience, you know, and we feel very alone, like we're the only person who is able to see this thing coming for us. You know, we can see it in a way that isn't real for the people around us with respect to us specifically, right? And the way that we overcome that is not by beating it, because you can't. It's coming for you no matter what you do. And so the way that you overcome that is you share the knowledge of that with someone else, and you move past the depression that you know that sort of initiates, and move back to sort of a childlike intimacy where you say we're going to hold on to each other, and that's what's going to make it okay despite the inevitability.
That's what I liked about the movie was that tone. Everyone is quiet. They talk softly. They're they're just even like the filter and the lens was a little muted. Everything is just kind of like sedated, and they all feel like weary and exhausted. My favorite character and the one that I identify with the most, the one that I pretended I was the guy that ends up. What's his name? The friend Pete, Paul.
Paul.
Paul. That he one scene in particular, and this is something that I'm very keenly aware of in movies because of my own personal history, was the scene, and this was a very provocative scene for me, was when he's like, at first, he says, "I'll sleep over at your house," and they're like, "No, no, 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 absolutely not. Would rather die than have you sleep next to me, than be near me." And then he's on the couch, and she comes out, and she just very gently, she just nudges his leg with his foot, and I could read everything that was going on in his mind. And he's looking at her, and he doesn't know what she wants, and she knows what she wants, but he doesn't know how to ask for it or what to do. And so there's this very gentle and sincere moment that's conveyed through body language because nothing has been said.
One of the things I think we all kind of touched on that's interesting, and I think all of our views sort of explain this, is the fact that once you've seen the monster, you can't unsee it, right? Like even if you've moved on, even if it's moved on to someone else, it's still in the purview of your sight. You can't get rid of it. You can't unsee it.
One of the questions I have written down here is, if we can see it, what does that mean? Because
It means
as
you're gonna
viewers,
die, buddy. That's what it
yeah,
means.
exactly, exactly. It's like there's one thing in a movie where they hint at it, like Blair Witch, where you never see it, but seeing the ghost means you're gonna die. So the fact that we can see it means it's kind of
Wouldn't it
giving
be
us a
great?
message.
Wouldn't it be great if there was like one person who like that dawned on them, like what you just said, the fact that you're in the audience and you can see it, and that's their first time that they realize their own mortality, like as they're watching the film, like they have like an existential breakdown from watching It Follows. That would be
I
amazing.
actually know someone who, well, I'll just put it this way. My daughter, when she was watching with her friends, um, some of her friends hadn't watched movies like that before. They've watched horror, but nothing that was good. A lot of the campy shit, you know. And so one of her friends was watching this and she was like, "Oh my gosh, no matter what, if you end up having that happen, you're going to die. Like if someone else dies, you're going to die. Like you're inevitably going to die. It's going to happen. You're going to die. We're all going to die." And Kylie's like, "Yeah, we're all going to die." And then Kylie started to sound like a nihilist meme. Like I was cracking up. She's like, "We're all going to die. Just get over it. Watch the movie, enjoy it. This is the last time you're going to be able to enjoy it because you're going to die soon." And it was dark and funny, um, seeing these teenagers really think about their own mortality, that it's going to happen. And that's an age where you're not really thinking about death. You're thinking you're going to live forever. But hearing teens at that age really contemplate their mortality because of the film, I thought that was fantastic. I know it's scary, but it's also important. It's
She
something we
she
need to
really
understand.
she really saw the monster. Like she literally saw the monster in the
Yes.
monster movie. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah,
That's what the film does, though. I mean, even though we already know it, because we sit around and talk about these dark things all the time, but seeing someone really reflect on it for the first time and just be like, "Oh my god!" And she was screaming. She was hiding under the blankets. She's like, "I'm gonna die! I'm gonna die! We're all gonna die!" Kylie's like,
You're like, if you don't shut the fuck up, I'm gonna kill you. So
and
she
that
had
is how you're gonna die.
that Dostoevsky moment at the end, right, where it's like within an hour, and then within 30 minutes, and then within a minute, right? That kind of countdown, that anxiety. That's what a lot of this movie brought out for me when I first watched it. I really like movies that are slow burns and they're very atmospheric and they produce a sense of anxiety and dread, whatever that means for you. I think what we established kind of in our first episode altogether is that we all get very different things from horror movies, and the sorts of films that pull out that dread, pull out that anxiety, are radically different depending on your own personal psychology. And for a film like this, with It Follows, it really just reminded me of a time when mortality became something incredibly close to me. And it was like I wasn't even a kid when this happened to me. I mean, I remember, I think, being a kid and kind of thinking about death, but I always thought about it within the context like of a religious interpretation where you don't really die. It's like a fake death. It's like a transition, right? If you're a religious believer, if you're a Christian, for example, you
It's like
you transit.
graduating school.
Yeah, it's like graduating. That's exactly right. You're just transitioning to the next grade, right? And when you lose that, a couple things happen. One is an unbelievable sense of dread and anxiety and fear. I've told my friends this, but when
or
I
relief
when
and excitement.
well, okay, so that for me came later, right? So I think for a lot of people, it's a transition, right? So the first stage for me, in realizing my own mortality, and I mean when I say realizing my own mortality, I mean really contemplating that I'm a being unto death, right? To pull some Heideggerian shit out, I'm made to die for all intents and purposes. And when I really thought about that, when it dawned on me, I was like in my mid to late 20s. I had just lost my faith, and death became not a transition, but something final, something that could happen at any moment. Like when I went to sleep, I could just sleep forever. I remember not sleeping for days. There was a period where I didn't sleep for like 3 or 4 days because I was scared that if I closed my eyes, I just wouldn't exist anymore, right? And this happened to me kind of late in life. And this film pulls out that same dread. When I was watching it, I just felt kind of the same way. I felt like, I'm since, say I'm over it as though you're really ever over it, but you move on. Um, like Jonas said, it can become an exciting thing, and that's the next thing is you learn things from it. So to me, It Follows is kind of a challenge. It's a challenge to look at death and transition and pull things from it in your own life that you can learn, that give you kind of a 70 on your gravestone before you die. It makes you look at the world in a much more raw way, right? Where this truth is hanging over your head and you have to live in light of it. And I think that's that's what I got from the film. It spoke to me and made me feel kind of like I did all those years ago when I was freaking out about what I was going to do because I was going to die.
But one of the things that kind of tracked the theme of mortality for me was also the theme of, it's kind of like there's sort of a Catholic element of original sin to this. Like in Catholicism, traditionally, sin is transmitted sexually from mother to child and so on and so forth, and that carries with it, the curse of mortality and all this other baggage. And one of the things that I thought the film sort of metaphorically represented in addition to mortality was kind of a perpetuation of cycles of abuse. Like the notion that especially the way the ghost or it is transmitted to Jay at the very beginning, where everything seems fine, everything's been cool, and then all of a sudden there's this violence. It's not, he doesn't try to persuade her, he doesn't say sit down and wait with me here, maybe you'll see what's going on, or you know what I mean. It's violent. She wakes up naked and bound to a chair, you know what I mean, and there's an abusive element to it, and it's implicit that this transmission, when it's not done with complete, like, informed consent, as it's done with Paul, in every other case, the transmission of the ghost is in some form sort of implicitly kind of awful or abusive in some way.
It's,
Like
it's rapey. It's
yeah,
rapey.
when she's looking at the folks out in the ocean or on the lake or whatever, and it's kind of implied that she might be wanting to have sex with them to carry on the ghost. That would obviously be dark. It would obviously be super dark. It'd be kind of like a murderous thing to do, to transmit it to somebody and then not say anything about it, right?
Yeah. Antonio, you're right, because there's so many, like, God, and I'm thinking about other things in the movie in light of that. So, like, for example, when Jay sees the girl all tattered and beaten up and she's urinating herself, there's like sexual assault elements in that. Do you know what I mean? You get that vibe of kind of an abuse or
Yes.
a rape.
That was something I noticed throughout the entire film. As a rape victim, I could tell that they were trying to give elements of that, and there were triggering moments, I'm sure, for certain people who've gone through certain kinds of abuses. I can watch those things and actually feel some form of vindication from it. So I'm sure some people might be harmed by some of this imagery and some of the things that we're seeing, whereas someone like me can feel like, okay, I'm not alone, and other people have experienced these things, and artists are trying to portray these situations.
Sure.
Specifically from the woman who's obviously heavily abused and urinating on herself. That was very strong imagery for me, but it felt vindicating for me and was a way of, like, dealing with my issues, right? Of course, when we see her laying in the car and she's, like, flickering the flower, I feel like that's her just still trying to be happy about her sexuality. Everything's great. She went that extra step and is still just happy with her flipping around her sexuality, and then he just comes over and destroys what is there. And you see her hand, like, kind of flop onto the flower, and you're just like, oh my gosh. It was very, very powerful imagery for me. Very, very powerful. And the fact that the rape that I had experienced was my first experience, and it was a friend of mine that was very close to me, that I trusted. It was one of those things where I was like, oh my gosh, this is a very powerful moment for me, and I'm going to try to take this in and try to still understand the film. But it was hard. It was a hard moment. And I know that whoever was making this film has either known somebody or has experienced it themselves, because the imagery was way too strong.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that it manifests even in subtler ways too. Like, for example, with Greg, when she transmits it to Greg, there's kind of a dual aspect of that that's sort of abusive. There's the first aspect of that is there's kind of a lack of informed consent, because Greg doesn't actually accept that this thing is going to come for him, that this is an inevitability that he needs to prepare for. And at the same time, Jay is operating kind of under the mentality, she's trying to relieve herself of this burden, right? And so she's operating under the mentality of, well, this is horrible, but he can take it, right? And so I'm going to do this thing that's awful to him, but he can take it, and it doesn't matter if he doesn't fully accept and he doesn't have fully informed consent. He can take it. At least now it's not going to be my problem anymore. Now the burden is shifted onto somebody else. Now I've imposed my problems on on somebody else, even if they didn't necessarily completely consent to it. And
Which is
out of
what
this,
some people do when they get raped.
exactly.
They will then rape as well. I'm not saying all people who rape because I've been raped and I don't rape, but I'm just saying that there is that idea that when you've been abused or when you've been attacked, that you will sometimes do it to others and actually feel like they can handle it, and actually feel like it's normalized. So that could be a really dark message that is sent through the film, honestly.
Yes, and the difference between Greg and Paul is that Greg is approached with the attitude of, I'll pass my problems on to him, right? And Paul is approached with the mentality of, I'm going to take your burden on and we're going to carry it together, which is a very, very important thematic difference. One of the really interesting things about this movie that is unusual in modern cinema, as far as the cinematography goes, which I thought was really interesting, and also contributes to the sort of anachronistic sense that they develop in the movie, and this ties in with the Detroit scene, is that establishing and transitional shots are much more heavily emphasized in this movie than in almost any other modern picture. And this is a modern innovation. Okay, if you actually go back and watch movies from like the 70s, the 70s is really a period, and you can see this even in TV shows as well. Watch movies from the 70s and watch when people get in their cars and drive places, okay? Because you will notice that the camera lingers on them driving places to a much greater extent than you will see in modern cinema. You will see that going places is an important, watching the car go places is a really important element in older school movies that you see almost completely bleed out by the time you get to the 2000s. And It Follows definitely harkens back to these older movies as far as really emphasizing travel times and travel experiences. And it also does this in the establishing shots. For the most part, in modern movies, you'll see establishing shots are like 5 seconds long. You'll have a wide shot of some kind of building where the people are supposed to be, and then it'll smash cut to inside the building where now they're having an interaction or whatever. And there's much more slow panning around to establish the whole scene in It Follows, and there's a whole lot of elements of lingering the camera on particular elements, taking a long time without any dialogue, not smash cutting inside, watching people just go inside and then cutting inside after they've already gone, etc. And the other thing that I wanted to sort of bring up is the soundtrack. We've mentioned the soundtrack only in merest passing, and honestly, as I think Noah said earlier, it's one of the best elements of the movie, and it's one of the most powerful elements of the movie, and the movie wouldn't succeed without it. The soundtrack for me was really interesting because it's one of these, again, sort of consciously timeless elements. It's retro, in a way that honestly really reminded me of the Stranger Things soundtrack. Very, very similar. It also reminded me of Jack Wall's work. He's a composer who's done a bunch of stuff. He's composed for a few video games. I think the one you guys might be most familiar with is Mass Effect. His music is done similarly, and so there's an interesting juxtaposition in the musical style, because on the one hand it's retro, it's clearly designed to sound like it comes from like an 80s movie or what have you, but on the other hand it also sounds like some much more modern works that are very synthesizer heavy as well. And so I would class the soundtrack as kind of retro ambient, and I think it's really important in a couple respects, both in establishing the referential but also timeless quality of the movie, and then at the same time, the soundtrack is very subtle. There's no vocals in any of the elements of the soundtrack. You don't actually even hear any songs playing on the radio at any point, I don't think, which is an important element to note. And there are huge periods of silence in the movie. You know, the actual soundtrack probably doesn't play for more than 50% of the movie's running time, and so it's clearly very tone painting in its intention. It's just designed as a brush stroke across particular scenes to add the necessary uh, audio color, so to speak, to a scene.
I just want to add to your comment about the long establishing shots. One scene in particular that comes to mind that I thought was really well done was the 360-degree shot in the school. I mean, 360-degree shots are always effective. I I've never, especially when there's nothing at the end of the circle, because it just builds tension. Whether there's something there or not, you expect something to be there, and that expectation builds and builds and builds, and it crescendos once it comes to the end of the loop, whether something is there or not. So, um,
Yeah, just to add to that, or to add to the music component, it was very. I enjoyed the fact it was very synth heavy. It was almost like an early John Carpenter. It was. That's a really good way to put it, Antonio. It was like retro, but not retro. That's a perfect way to put that for me. I felt like it was almost. It was. It was from a long time ago, but like just from now. And that sounds incredibly weird. But I
John
basically
Carpenter's
took.
reference
Yeah.
obviously is much more heavily highlighted in the identity of it, because it behaves almost exactly like the thing, right? It can take the form of anything that it's come in contact with, basically, and it prefers to take a form that is emotionally damaging to its target, in the same way as the thing. Now, of course, it doesn't have the same, and it's also sort of an alien being that is implacable and extremely hard to get rid of, and is also, uh, violent and kind of feeds off of paranoia and suspicion and the notion that other people don't believe that it is where it really is. Very similar thematically to the thing in a lot of different ways. Honestly, I thought that it was kind of a throwback to Lovecraft as well, in the way that it approached that.
So we've been jumping around kind of our enjoyment aspects of the film, and then our appreciative aspects, kind of the things that we can objectively pull from the film, and then the things that we liked and we enjoyed about it. If you could give this movie a score 1 to 10, right? Let's keep it simple. 1 to 10, what would you give this film in terms of enjoyment?
I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. I thought it was really, really well executed. It's a very well artistically done film. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's some elements that you could quibble with it. And I think that it may have been too ambitious of a film in some ways. I think that with a slightly more intense focus on the main themes, you might have been able to have an even more powerful experience. But it's a very powerful film. There isn't anything else like it in horror today, and it definitely is. It definitely really walks the tightrope well of being both a nostalgia trip and innovating on the genre, which is, I think, a brilliant accomplishment. I don't give a whole lot of movies higher than 8. This one would get a 9.
So, I've been going through the 1001 movies you're supposed to see before you die. And you watch a lot of the innovative movies, the movies that kind of break a mold and start something new that's going to happen in film. And they're not necessarily the greatest movies you've ever seen, but you're like, oh shoot, this is gonna, everyone's gonna start doing this. Or you look back on movies and you're like, this started all of these other movies. This is definitely one of those movies. It's going to definitely influence horror film for just years and years and years to come. It has to be up there as a 9 because of that. It has to be, because it's going to change how horror films are going to be made, and it's going to make legitimate a genre that I've loved for so long. So I'm very much enjoyed it. I watched it over and over again, enjoyed every single time I watched it, which is very rare for me with movies. Usually I watch a movie and I'm like, okay, I'm good. There's only a few movies that I can rewatch, like Clerks. I, for some reason, can watch that a million times. But most movies I can't. This was a rewatchable over and over again, by the way. Like, it was like back to back to back. And still got something new out of it every time I watched it, too, by the way. So it has to be really high up there. And I don't normally give high ratings to very many films, but this is a very important film, I think, and I think will stand out decades to come. Yeah.
there are certain movies that you watch it the first time, and I remember only seeing this once, and at first you walk out and you're like, okay, it was good, it wasn't bad, but it was just a movie. And then the more you think about it, the longer you think about it, you can't stop thinking about it. It starts to set in, and you remember things that somehow you remember things that were less important to you when you were initially watching the film. And so it builds, and it kind of it has to like slow cook in your head for, and it's still slow cooking. So my initial reaction was probably 5, a perfect 5.0. After this discussion, probably in the high 9s. This discussion helped me appreciate the movie more because I was able to actually converse and either elaborate or complain or praise. We're all having a discussion about it helped me think about the movie better. Rather than if I had seen it by myself at middle of the afternoon, you know, it was fine, but I knew what affected me, but I needed other opinions to sort of ground and expand on my own thinking. I needed competing thoughts for me to honestly examine it.
It's definitely a movie that benefits from analysis, that ripens with analysis, if you will.
Talking about horror movies, who would have thought? It'd be great if someone made a podcast about that. I don't know. Yeah, for me, I would say, 9.5 for me. I think the only one I would give that's a little higher than this, and this may be controversial, is Evil Dead 2. Evil Dead 2, I think, is the greatest horror movie of all time, but damn, this is close to me. So yeah, I mean, 9.5 ish for me. The ambience of this film, the slow cook, the lack of shit that makes me jump out of my skin. There's a couple of things like that in the film. I think the one thing we didn't talk about is the jump sequences were actually they were, there weren't many, but they were great. They were really good. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of horror. The tall guy was a huge. Okay.
Yeah,
the tall guy was a huge deal in my house. Everyone freaked out. I don't know what it is, but he was the scariest element to everybody.
But also, if you're taking from this film, if you're watching this and you're starting to interpret things in lieu of, I should say, in light of sexual assault, if that's part of the narrative for you, then seeing a 7'7" guy with black eyes walk behind a young female like that out of nowhere, sort of just aggressively, that's going to be fucking horrifying. I mean, it's not horrifying even if you're not pulling that shit from the film, but if that's how you're interpreting these other aspects of the film, that only adds to that fear. I think I felt connected to this horror film in a way I haven't felt to many other horror films, because of its ambience, because of its idea of death, that it's something that stalks you, and that's something that I had to reflect on constantly. And so without it just coming out and telling me that that's what it's about, I mean, it's pretty clear. I think we're all agreeing that death is one of the pinnacle elements of this film. It's one of the main things that you're supposed to take away from it. The work that you do in how you approach death and how this film presents it, it brought me back to that time when I had to think about these things, but it did it in a way that was like, shit, it wasn't, I mean, it was scary, but it was almost familiar. It was almost okay. It felt warm. It sounds so weird to say that. It's hard for me to describe it. It was scary, but I don't know, maybe it just felt good to know that this is such a deeply common thing that people struggle with, that this film can present it the way it did. It just felt I felt very connected to the themes that the film was trying to throw at me in a way I really don't for other films that I even really like. So like the next film we're going to talk about after it follows is Let Me In. We'll probably watch Let the Right One In, but I specifically want to watch the English version. I know that's blasphemy to some people, and there's a reason for why I'm advocating that, and we'll talk about that in the next podcast. But like even in that film and in other films that I really, really like, and I think they're some of my favorite horror films, I don't think I've ever felt so connected to a central issue in a film than I did in It Follows. And so yeah, I'd give it a 9.5, with the only other movie topping it being Evil Dead. And I got to tell you, the reasons that I like Evil Dead are unbelievably different than the reasons that I like It Follows. Yeah, so like there's certain films where I can enjoy just the shit out of them, like Evil Dead, but I can't, like, we can't have, I don't, could we have a conversation about Evil Dead 2 like we're having about It Follows? Like I want to say no. Like I really do want to say no. I feel like Antonio's gonna like give me this amazing interpretation of Evil Dead 2 right now that's gonna blow my socks off. So I'm kind of baiting him. But I just like I don't think that's possible, and I think that's why I really liked It Follows. Is it allowed me to enjoy the film, but it also allowed me to appreciate it in a way that was familiar to me.
Yeah, like I kind of started out saying, it to me was a very essentialist experience, and
Yeah.
that's what makes it successful is that, and it's kind of an irony, right? That in order to convey something that is so basic and so primal and so common to human experience, you have to put in so much fucking work. It takes so much careful framing and cutting things out and shaping things just the right way to evoke the right shade of thing right here, you know? And it takes all that work, and the reason, but at base, the irony is the reason it's successful is all that complexity goes into transmitting something that's so basic that we all feel it on a gut level all the time.
So one of the things I liked from the first podcast is that I noticed we all interpret shit fairly differently. And I like being able to come to a movie and having us all sort of give our own perspective. The cool thing about this one, it was a little bit of the opposite because it's so essentialist, like Antonio was saying. I think we all kind of got the death stuff from it. We got the mortality stuff from it. We got the adolescence, the sexual anxieties, the sexual fears. It's an incredibly complicated, complex film that talks about a very basic and simple component of human existence that may be the most important thing that we can talk about. I mean, to me, talking about death and understanding death appropriately as the finality of your existence and not a transitory, that's not a transition into another life, but in understanding the finality of your own existence, that is unbelievably important in the sort of thing that it produces in you. It allows you to create yourself in a whole new way. It allows you to understand why you value things so heavily. You value things precisely because there's this intuitive sense that you're going to lose them one day. And that does work in you. That changes you. You sort of become your own work of art when you take those very fundamental and very basic things that life shows you seriously. And I think that was the beauty of It Follows. All right, so I apologize about the abrupt ending there. We just went on and rambled and talked about horror movies after that. So follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Deadly Analysis. You can find us on Facebook at the Deadly Analysis Podcast. I hope you liked what you listened to. If you did, subscribe on our YouTube channel. Send us a message. I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for taking the time to listen.